sure the audio. Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. Super glad you're here. This is Dr. Mike Roncesvalles. You ready to learn how to break the chains of addiction in your life? This session is for you. So, as you know, if you've been watching Wellness Wednesday for any length of time, that addiction is not just the behavior of alcohol or drugs. Addiction is any behavior that's compulsive, that medicates your pain. That's why you can be addicted to, obviously, alcohol or marijuana or cocaine or heroin, whatever, but you can also be addicted to food. You can be addicted to technology. You can be addicted to pornography. You can be addicted to people pleasing. You could be addicted to work. It's just any behavior that literally medicates your pain and gets you away from how you're feeling. That's an addiction. So if you want more information about that, I really would encourage you. You can find more kind of comprehensive info on the last Wellness Wednesday. That's in the archive on the Live Well coaching platform. If you're watching this in a course, I think we're actually going to turn this into a course. Just look at some of the other videos, and you'll understand fully kind of the connection between pain and what addiction really is. So one thing I love that we said last week was the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. It's not really about addiction, right? It's about the pain that's underneath the addiction. And our definition, just so you can kind of put the pieces together, is an addiction is any behavior that finds temporary pleasure or relief in cravings if you suffer negative consequences from it and you're unable to give it up. That's an addiction. So today we're going to really kind of lean in to the why. We're going to lean into kind of the root of addiction, which might not surprise you guys, but ultimately the root of addiction is trauma. It's trauma. This is something we didn't know 25 years ago. We couldn't look at brains. We didn't understand what was happening in your brain and in your body. But now that we've been able to scan people's brains and really lean into the diagnostics surrounding addiction, we know that in almost every case, addiction is rooted in trauma. So let me explain some of that for you so that you understand. I'm thinking of a client that I had that was kind of your quintessential drinker, like heavy drinker. He's maybe 40 years old. He'd been drinking a long time, since he's a kid, honestly. Started drinking in high school. A lot of people have that story. A lot of you have that story. Just partying and just hanging out and having some beers with the boys, and that was his story, right? But it wasn't just alcohol that was the problem. Like, what no one knew was he couldn't sleep at night. He had panic attacks during the day. And it was years of like white knuckling this anxiety that put Michael, this client, into a state of addiction where he really would just drink to get away from the anxiety, as we talked about last time. So I'll never forget this session that we had, because I'm sitting with this guy. It's like this story I've seen a million times, right? I've talked to people. Oh my gosh, man. I bet 1,000 times, 1,000 different people. It's not an overstatement. 1,000 different people who tell me, man, there's nothing like Tito's and Club that gets me away from anxiety. It's nothing like 4 beers that gets me away from anxiety. So I'm having this conversation. For me, it's just sort of like normal. I kind of live a weird life, right? You're a psychologist. You hear this stuff all the time. And it dawned on me, I haven't really leaned into childhood with this client yet. So I'm like, Mike, tell me about your childhood. By the way, Michael's not his real name. You guys know that. Every time I tell these stories, I change the name. There's no identifying information. We're calling him Michael. So, Michael, tell me about your childhood. What happened? I'm thinking he's going to go into high school and talk about partying, and he surprised me because he started talking about early on, like elementary school, 6 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old. I was like, this is interesting. I wasn't expecting it. And he described a family where his dad drank and worked a lot. He made it clear no one was abusive. It was a good family. He made sure he said that. Normal. He said, my family's normal. But as he described a relationship with his dad in particular, he said things like, my dad he just never had a ton of time for me. He never really had moments where it was just me and him and we were hanging out throwing the football. He made it a point to say he never hit me. He never slapped me. No sexual abuse. No, wasn't that. He said he was just absent. That's the word he used. He's just absent. And I was like, like that word for me just has such meaning as I work with clients, especially clients who struggle with an addiction to anything, alcohol, pornography, anything. If your parents felt absent, what you're really saying is, I never felt like they saw me. I never felt like they really were able to connect with me as a person. And there's a million different reasons why parents struggle with this. Some parents literally are just you're trying to pay the bills, right? You're just grinding out work. You've got so much to do, all the volunteer activities, getting the kids to all the practices and doing their thing and dancing. And I get it. So some of it's just busyness, but some of it is their parents that just, they struggle to enter their children's world. Maybe because no one entered their world when they were kids. But they don't know how to sit and watch SpongeBob and feel content with it. They don't know how to get on the floor and play Legos. And that might be you. You might be like, Mike, it's not that I don't like my kids, and it's not like I don't want to spend time with them, but I can't put Legos together for 45 minutes. That's just not me. And I get it and I understand, but I think the end result of that is that sometimes kids just feel like their parents don't see them. They don't connect with them. They don't feel attached. And that's a pretty significant issue. And I hear that a lot with people that struggle with addiction. If I can get them talking about their family of origin, there's usually a moment where there will be sort of this little hidden trauma where they're able to verbalize, it's really not that I had this horrible family that just wasn't invested in me and didn't love me and didn't take care of me. That obviously is a problem if that does happen to some kids, but that's the exception, not the rule. Most of the time it's just I felt unseen, unheard, just like nobody was with me. I felt alone. And so when you hear the word trauma, a lot of times we don't relate it to that kind of experience because we experience it as big T trauma, right? That's when I think of trauma, especially early on in my career, is like big T trauma. Big T trauma is war. I got in this massive car accident and I thought I was going to die, or I woke up in the hospital. I got assaulted. I was sexually abused. I got raped. I got mugged in New York City. That'd be bad, right? Sometimes I worry about that in New York City. That's not the only way to describe trauma. Because in addition to these big T traumas, you've got little T traumas. And little T traumas are subtle, they're chronic, and they show up every day. And that's really the definition of a little t trauma. It's like these things that we experience consistently, chronically, that don't really go away. And so think about the 12-year-old that's bullied in junior high school because he hasn't hit a growth spurt yet, and he's just assaulted literally every day because kids are coming at him verbally and making fun of him and telling him he's not enough. And think of that kid every day. That happens to some kids, and it dramatically affects their brain. Like, it really does sort of shift the way you see the world, but it also shifts your neurology. And so that's why a lot of the people that work in addictions talk about the reality that trauma is not really what happens to you. It doesn't matter whether it's war or a car accident or an assault or bullying or a parent that just never sees you. Trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. Does that make sense? So the internal scarring that develops when our emotional needs go unmet, that's a little t trauma. So think about the teenagers that are just forced to suppress their emotion. These guys that are 15 and 14, and they're emotional, and don't cry, don't be a girl, don't be a baby. Boys don't cry. Like, that's a trauma. And I know, please understand when I say this word, I'm not trying to be, oversensitive and tell people that any little thing is a trauma and it impacts the rest of your life. But guys, I've got to be honest, right? And the truth is that some people have a reaction to this kind of thing because their emotional needs are unmet, and it does impact them. And what it impacts is like their sense of self, their view of the world, the way they see who they are in this world and what makes them acceptable and worthwhile and significant and valuable and lovable. So you just think about that internal disappointment that happens over and over and over again. That's the little t trauma. There's an assessment that we give to almost every client that comes to our clinics. It's called the Adverse Child Experience Checklist, is what I would say. So the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience Checklist, is grounded in science. And so I want to tell you a little bit about this, and you'll understand why. In the 1990s, there was this massive study that was conducted as a longitudinal study, and it was called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, right? And they asked participants about 10 types of trauma that they had when they were young. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. So some of the big T traumas. Emotional neglect, little t trauma. Witnessing domestic violence, big T trauma. A parent with addiction or mental illness, big T trauma and little t trauma. And then a parent that was incarcerated or parents that got divorced. Again, big T trauma and little t trauma. When I say that, I mean like there's an event, my parents got divorced, but then that was met with or followed by years of hurt and disconnection and parents fighting and custody. Does that make sense? So here's what they found during this study. 67% of people had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 8 people had 4 or more. And the more ACEs a person had, the higher their risk for addiction, depression, suicide, and you ready for this? Even heart disease and cancer. Wow. So if you're like me, you want to believe, forget all the childhood stuff. Look, we can't blame parents, and we can't. But I was born and bred in this, growing up in my family. That's kind of how I was raised. And because of that, I was drawn to that in my training as a psychologist. Cognitive behavioral therapy is what I was like all about, because cognitive behavioral therapy is very action oriented. It's not really kind of digging around in the past, and you don't talk about childhood a lot. And that's how I started my career. I was like, look, we're not going to talk about things when we're 10. We're not going to talk about how bad your mom was or how messed up your dad was. And you're 45 years old. You got to move on. And it's true. You do have to move on if you're 45 years old. You can't live in the past. You can't let your past define your present and your future. However, you can't run from your past, and you can't repress your past. You have to resolve your past and redeem your past. Because if you don't, the hard data shows that your past can dramatically impact your physical, emotional, and spiritual state. I'm going to read the stats again because I think it's crazy. The more ACEs a person had, the higher their risk for addiction, depression, suicide, heart disease, and cancer. So my whole point is you have to look at the past. You have to look at some of the little T traumas in order to fully understand your addiction. I'll give you a few more stats. I just find it fascinating, so bear with me on this. If you had 4 or more ACEs, so, they asked 10 questions about emotional neglect and domestic violence, and parents that, went through divorce or had an addiction. If you had 4 or more of those things happen when you were a kid, you were 5 times more likely to abuse alcohol. That's a nutso number. What? 4 or more ACEs, you're 5 times more likely to abuse alcohol. 10 times more likely to use injection drugs, heroin, namely. 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. This is drop the mic kind of data. So these aren't behavioral failures. They're trauma responses. So we can say all we want, doesn't matter what happened in the past, and we've got to get beyond it, and we've got to move through it. And agreed. I help people do it all day, every day. So you're not looking at a guy that is going to help you just sort of muddle in your past. I am telling you that if you haven't looked at your past and you haven't examined your past and you haven't looked for the traumas, especially the little T trauma, the chronic traumas that lasted for days and weeks and months and years, you're never going to fully understand why you're compulsively shopping or compulsively pleasing people or compulsively looking at pornography or drinking your brains out every day. And so I know I'm pushing hard here, but I want you to understand the past, and especially unresolved traumas from the past, are part of what's driving an addiction. Alcohol's so easy, right? Because it's just this metaphor. There are plenty of people in this world that can have a couple beers with the boys and they're fine. No problem. They do it for years and years and years until the day they die, and they're fine. But if you're struggling with alcohol, what's different? What's different about you? What makes you kind of that guy that one is too many, 1,000 is never enough, and 14 beers later, you're drunk off your butt, and you're making the same choices that cause harm, and you're causing problems for everybody you love. Why is that happening? I'm telling you that one of the keys that you need to look at, you need to let yourself lean into, is what went on early on in my past. Because that's a key to what's driving the addiction. All right, so why? Like, what is this kind of trauma? What does this little T trauma do to your brain and your body? Well, when people grow up in an emotionally unsafe, unpredictable environment, their nervous systems learn to stay on high alert. That's called toxic stress, right? So it essentially changes brain development. So if you're exposed to these traumas, even if it's not on purpose, go back to the 13-year-old kid in junior high school who just happens to sit next to some loser bully, who's like bullying him for a semester or 3 years. Like that, the shift that happens in brain development is real. Here's some of the things that happen. The amygdala, which is I've talked about before, it's what controls fear. It's the center of fight or flight in your brain, becomes overactive. Why? Because you're always in a state of fight or flight. You're always in a state of threat. Think about the story of Michael I told at the beginning. He wakes up every day, desperately want to be seen. I desperately want to feel valued. I desperately want to feel like I'm enough. And you constantly feel like you're not. Well, your brain doesn't just develop naturally in that. Your brain develops out of this deep fear that your needs aren't getting met. So what happens when your amygdala, your fight or flight response is turned on every day? I'll be honest with you guys. I don't know what this is like, because you take Michael's story. I had the opposite. I grew up in this family, and it was like I had all this attention, and my mom was constantly doting on me, and my dad was spending time with me. So I don't have that activation in my amygdala that just happens quickly. But some people that struggle with addiction, man, their brains have never fully developed the ability to manage threat because your amygdala was turned on 24/7. Number two, as you experience that trauma, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, remember that. So that's that's your frontal lobe up here. It develops more slowly. So if you're exposed to this kind of little t trauma, if you have all these ACEs in your life, your prefrontal cortex is not developing. So you kind of develop that ability to say, ready, fire, aim. You know people like that? Was that you in high school? Ready, fire, aim. Should be ready, aim, fire, right? But some of it's just like impulsivity. It's like, bam. Why? Well, because your brain, because of all the trauma, because of what you were experiencing, didn't develop that ability to kind of put that prefrontal cortex in play minute by minute, moment by moment to regulate your behavior. And then number three, your dopamine system becomes depleted. So people that grow up in that constant trauma, think of Michael. He's a little kid. He's like constantly wanting attention, he wants to be seen. Well, what does that do to a little kid? Well, his dopamine system's not activated near as much as a kid that feels that sense of connection and attachment, right? And do you remember what dopamine is? It's a feel-good chemical. So those kids don't really know or learn on a neurological level how to enjoy their life, how to just feel content. That's what dopamine does. So you've been beating yourself up for years thinking, why am I so impulsive? Why do I feel fear threat all the time? And I'm defensive every time someone talks to me. Why can't I have fun or just enjoy my life or feel content the way I need to? Well, because you grew up in constant little t trauma. And that changed the way your brain developed. So when someone says, I don't know why I'm addicted, you kind of have to say, okay, there is a reason you're addicted, and it's directly related to some things that happen really early on. So as that happens, and as you're kind of living that out, think about what you're pursuing. You're pursuing experiences that will, number one, help you feel safe, right? Like if fight or flight is constantly activated and more likely to be activated as an adult, you're constantly going to be looking for safety. You're constantly going to be looking for dopamine. I want to feel good. I want to feel different. I want to feel content. And then you're more impulsive than other people. So you have this thing that gives you dopamine. So when I buy things on Amazon, I feel awesome. Well, that's a quest for dopamine. That's an addiction to dopamine. You're medicating the neurological wiring that you have. So that's the fertile ground of addiction, and that's how it grows in trauma. Now, I'm going to tell you something that's super tough, right? Pain that isn't transformed is transmitted. It's one of the hardest truths that we have to face with addiction. Unhealed trauma doesn't disappear, it goes underground. And it shows up in self-destruction. It shows up in overcompensation. It shows up in anxiety and perfectionism. And yes, it shows up in addiction. And this is not about blame. I'm not trying to blame anyone. And I promise you, if you go home and tell your spouse or your friends, Dr. Mike is saying that it makes perfect sense that I'm struggling with an addiction because I went through all this trauma, I am not telling you to blame your past. I'm telling you to resolve your past. You're an adult. Like, it's time to heal, right? So if you make the decision to just persist in an addiction because now, I have this excuse because my brain is different, it's changed, and my neurological wiring is different, you're missing the point. What I'm trying to say is, I want you to understand why this has happened. I want you to understand why you're addicted, but then I want you to go after change. So I think the important part is to understand there's a context for addiction. You're not a bad seed. You're not messed up. You're not less than. You're not broken. You're not damaged goods. See, I know all those words. Why? Because I hear it all the time with people struggling with addiction. And I want you to understand that you are a child of God, created in His image, and that there's a God that's bigger than you, that created you out of all the combinations of DNA that He could have put together. He chose you. And you were created with a purpose and a plan for your life. And the issue is that all the stuff that's unresolved that you've been through is the very thing that's keeping you from moving forward. And so what we've got to do is we've got to begin to pursue healthy, right? We've got to begin to pursue like this quest to say, I will boldly, courageously, with abandonment, pursue healthy. And if you let yourself look at the reality of some of the things that were pretty painful, you'll start to see that your addiction was birthed in your pain and trauma, and that the path forward is to address and heal your pain and trauma. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit more today about what happens in the brain when we get addicted, and then we'll call it for today. So we talked about dopamine as the pleasure chemical, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about sort of how that plays out for you, so that you can understand what you're craving with alcohol or drugs or shopping or pornography or sex or whatever. Dopamine's essentially the neurotransmitter that drives reward, motivation, learning. Like I said before, it's sort of the feel-good chemical that makes us pursue food. It makes us pursue connection. It makes us pursue novelty. It makes us pursue sex. So even those 4 words I just used, food, sex, connection, and novelty, that's highly connected to addiction. Like, think of how many addictions are just craving novelty. If you struggle with sex addiction or pornography addiction, that is by a long shot one of the biggest things you're craving. That's dopamine. That gives you that sense of like, oh, this is cool. This is fun. This is unique. This is different. That is dopamine. Why do you want high fat, high sugar foods? Because there's just something unique about how awful they are for you. It's like, I want to do all the awful stuff. No. High fat, high sugar foods literally release dopamine. They dump dopamine in your brain. So it's the way that you can begin to just understand, man, I have this issue where, because of my wiring and probably what I've been through historically, that has made it difficult for me to release dopamine in my brain. And now I'm going after it through this addiction, and that dopamine system is basically gone haywire. So here's what happens with various dopamine surges in different substances. Okay. Food, high fat, high sugar food, 50% increase in dopamine instantly. Kind of crazy, right? Sex, 100% increase in dopamine. Think sex is not powerful? I read an article the other day in Psychology Today, and the headline was "Sex: the most powerful human experience." 100% increase in dopamine. It feels good. It's the feel-good chemical. Nicotine. This one's kind of weird. 200% increase in dopamine with nicotine. Twice as much as sex. Why is it so hard to quit smoking? Well, now you know. 200% increase in dopamine. Cocaine, which actually activates the same kind of receptor sites in the brain, is interesting as nicotine. But because of the molecular structure, it's a 350% increase in dopamine instantly. That's pretty wild, huh? Cocaine's really addictive. Nicotine is, because it activates the same receptor site, it's super addictive too. But if the molecule goes into the receptor site and it's nicotine, it kind of stays in there and it gets stuck. If it's cocaine, it goes in and then it goes out and it makes way for other cocaine molecules. So that you can see why that you get all this cocaine that's flooding the receptor site. It's almost twice as much dopamine, but that's why they're both crazy addictive. Ask most 13-year-olds in junior high school right now. That's why they can't quit vaping. And then one of the most staggeringly addictive substances in the world is methamphetamine. You know, a lot of people know this, but if you use meth one time, you could likely get addicted after one use. Why? 1,000% increase in dopamine levels in the brain. But the brain can't sustain these floods of pleasure, so what does it do? It downregulates. So you have fewer dopamine receptors, less natural motivation, and more dependence on the substance or the behavior for any relief. So think about how messed up this is. Because of some of your early trauma, you probably have, a less active dopamine reward system in your brain anyways. And then once you start using these substances that just skyrocket dopamine levels in your brain, your brain's not used to that instant spigot. So what does it do? It downregulates. Now I have fewer dopamine receptors. I have less natural motivation because I have less dopamine. And now I need the substance more. I want to feel that again. When I press buy on Amazon, that's pretty awesome. I just pressed it 10 other times today. Oh crap. Now I've spent $10,000. That's how that happens, right? So over time, things that used to bring joy, nature, relationships, a relationship with God, your spiritual life, just good, healthy things no longer feel rewarding. And that's why people that are really kind of in the trenches with addiction will say things like, I don't even get high anymore. I just don't want to be sick. I can't feel anything unless I'm using. There's lots of alcoholics that just, they don't feel like they can enjoy anything without a drink. There's some of you that are watching, that's you. You don't even know why, but you go for a drink in any situation, in any social setting, by yourself at night. Like you're grabbing a beer. Why? Because you just don't. It's like you don't feel anything. You don't feel that sense of joy. There's some of you that are addicted to food, and the only way you can feel good at night going to bed is if you had a sweet treat. I mean, stuff sounds simple, some of it. But it's not. It's all neurological realities. So, you look at the brain and how it shifts with addiction. It dramatically impacts the dopamine. It also dramatically impacts that prefrontal cortex. So I want to kind of loop back to that a little bit and help you understand that the prefrontal cortex and the loss of control that comes from that impulsivity is very, very real. So addiction weakens the ability to have self-control, to make good decisions, and to predict consequences. Yikes. Did I just describe some of you? Now does it make sense why you've made some of the choices that you've made when you're drinking alcohol? Now does it make sense to you why you've made some of the choices that you've made sexually? It does when you start to look at like this is real data. So that addiction system, or the addiction weakens the system that actually helps you put the brakes on impulsivity. And that's why even people who are highly intelligent, highly moral, highly motivated just can't stop. It's not a character issue. It's a hijacked brain. Does that make sense? There's some of you that, man, your Christian faith tells you there are some moral absolutes. I'm not about it. That's not me. I do not have sex outside of my marriage. I'm committed. I've made it. That's not me. I do not drink to excess and get hammered. That's just not me. I would never, ever be involved in pornography and human trafficking and all the stuff that happens with that industry. No, that's against my moral code. And 5 hours later, you're hammered. 5 hours later, you're you've fallen again with pornography. It's not that it's like you're not real. It's not like you're not a real Christian. It's not like you don't really have a moral code. It's that you don't understand your brain has been hijacked. And addiction, it's really not a choice to use. It's the absence of the choice not to, because of what's happened neurologically. So here's the good news. And this is super hopeful, because you listen to what we've talked about with the neurology of addiction, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm destined to forever be stuck in this addiction. Look, don't buy that. Don't go there. That's not real. You need to know the realities. You need to know why you keep falling, but you also need to know that the brain is malleable. You can build new neural pathways. We teach people to do it all the time. When I was trained, and I know you guys aren't going to believe this, I'm so young looking. I get it. Shockingly, it's a joke. 30 years ago when I was trained, I can't believe I can say 30 years ago about anything, but I was trained as a psychologist 30 years ago, and I was really taught can't build new neurons. That was the common wisdom at that point. And I used to believe that, man. When I was growing up, you would say, oh, that guy's brain dead. He smoked too much weed. He lost all his brain cells. That was what our neurologists told us. What we know now is that's very, very different. That is not true. You can build new neural pathways. You can take a brain that has been just really decimated by addiction, and over time, you can repair all of this. If you kind of combine sobriety, like you have to stop the addiction before you start to repair your brain. Otherwise, you're not going to repair your brain. But you combine that with therapy and insight where you're healing some of the traumas and community and purpose, and the brain begins to rewire. And what we find is dopamine pathways regenerate. Pretty awesome. And so some of you are like, man, I can't find contentment without a couple beers at night. I can't ever imagine myself if I, was just with one woman and I didn't have the idea of like a variety, or I can't imagine if I didn't look at the pornography that my friend, sends to me all the time. Right? Man, I don't even know that I could ever like just exist without eating cookies at night. Whatever the addiction is, I'm telling you, if you allow yourself to go through the pain of getting clean from the behavior, you'll start to see your dopamine pathways regenerate. Secondly, as the dopamine pathways regenerate, your emotional regulation will improve. So the negative emotion that we talked about early on, even think of last Wellness Wednesday, we were talking about addiction really it's driven by negative emotion. As you get the substance off the table, as you get the compulsive behavior off the table over time, as you heal, you'll find you have the ability to regulate. You can build the ability to regulate. And perhaps most importantly, the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, regains strength. So that part of you that's like, man, I'm just impulsive. I make these stupid choices every time. Why do I do that? You're going to find that you're exercising that prudence muscle. And it makes a difference. And you can rebuild your neurology. And that's why we can never give up. You can never tell yourself I'm broken, messed up, damaged goods. You're not broken. You just have to rewire your brain. All right. I'm sure you can tell I'm having a good time doing this. So I hope that we're getting information out to you that's helpful and that's hopeful. And I want you to know that as we do this, you're going to continue to build an awareness as to why you're addicted and why you're struggling with people pleasing your whole life and all the other things. Or you're going to say, I have hope and a new hope for the sobriety that's coming. Now, as we go forward here for the next couple weeks, we're going to get into the strategies of how you do this, of how you change and how you begin to really get clean, get sober, like stop the compulsive behaviors and begin to feel like yourself again. So that's all coming. I promise we're going to get into the how to break the chains of addiction. But man, in the meantime, really appreciate you letting me say some challenging things to you. I appreciate you allowing me to speak into your life. And I'm just expecting awesome things to come from the time that you're spending learning all this information. All right, guys, thanks so much.